last time the Howells Society were here, I was talking to Jeremy Dibble, who was my PhD supervisor, and we were talking about Hubert Parry, because it was the centenary of his death in 1918. And we had a great conversation about the relationship between Parry and Howells, and of course we wouldn't have any of the music really if it hadn't been for Parry and the fact that Parry sponsored the medical treatment that Howells had as a student, which was life-saving and came out of the pocket of Hubert Parry. And it was through his connections with lots of London doctors that Howells was able to have the latest medical treatment and receive the first radium treatment in the UK through what was then the Imperial Institute. I think the fact that they were so close nearby was also saved Howells' life. So that was very interesting. And then the Stanford Society asked me to talk about Howells and Stanford. And so I was thinking about that relationship, and that's grown into all sorts of things. And then COVID came along. And I was thinking today, it's interesting to think how Howells has changed since we were last here, which seems ridiculous because it wasn't that long ago. But actually, if you think about the number of recordings that have come out and the number of scores that have come out and the fact that we're still finding manuscripts and we're still publishing things and there's so much activity, I think Howells is such a moving target at the moment in that sense for musicologists. And at the same time, there's a lot of work going on. Obviously, I'm still doing a lot of work on Howells. There's about to be a new biography of Bliss with Paul Spicer. There's about to be a new biography of Arthur Benjamin by Wendy Hiscox, which both of those two books I think will be very important for our view of Howells. There's that mammoth volume that's to come out with Diana McVeigh on Finzi's letters, which is really very, very interesting. And Howells pops up in that. I think it's probably the first time in print that I've actually seen anybody acknowledge Howells' battles with depression. That's in there, writing to Finzi. Something that comes up a lot when I've interviewed people, but it's nowhere in print. So that was interesting. And so we've got this kind of momentum behind Howells' scholarship and study. And I wanted to invite Tom to have a discussion today so that we could touch upon that. Tom has completed degrees at Newcastle and Cambridge, and he's just finished a master's thesis on Herbert Howells and late style. And I think it's really interesting. He's literally just started a PhD with me at the Royal College of Music, and that's going to take that point as a starting point, particularly the Stabat Mater. So I thought we would start by asking you what late style is, because this is a highly loaded term, and it's a term that we really get from Beethoven scholarship, and I thought that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, I think sort of when I first started thinking about Howells and late style, we see late style at the minute. It sort of is filtered down into sort of all arts, and we think about late style generally as this kind of golden period at the end of the artist's life when they reflect upon what they've done with their life. They know that death is imminent, and how does that change their art? There's an excellent example of it in the Musée Picasso, for example, where they have a room just of the last works of Picasso. And you saw there's a weight immediately by calling them the last works. And I sort of thought about this and the weight that how does that change how we hear Howells' final pieces? And as we know, there's been some excellent scholarship on this already. Philip Cooke, for example, who I think we'll come to later. But also, I remember the first time I read through the Spicer biography, and he sort of refers to this period as a coda to Howells' life. And I thought, well, but is it a coda? Is there more to it? I had the absolute pleasure, because I came to Howells quite late, really. I remember in my Cambridge year with Harold, who is here, and we would sit and listen through all these services and sort of think about, wow, there's this piece and there's this piece, and it's got the gears in my head turning. But as Jonathan says, late style sort of came out of Beethoven, and generally the idea of late style really catapulted post-World War II, with a guy called Adorno who wrote about Beethoven. The slight problem is that all his writings on Beethoven were then collected and published posthumously, but he contradicts himself so often. So actually, part of the problem that academics have all the time is going, what's he actually trying to get at? Is he writing about Beethoven, or is it more generally about late style? And that's the problem that has plagued late style constantly, is the second you try and attach a sort of criteria to it, it then doesn't work, because then someone says, but look at this composer, they don't match this criteria. But the general sort of accepted thing is that there's a caesura in the output. There's a big change in direction with the composer. And immediately, upon reading this, I thought, we don't get that with Howells, do we? He's actually, there's no sort of moment where sort of late in life he kind of changes direction and shoots off somewhere else. So again, this is why I wanted to pursue this. But there's been all sorts of developments since Adorno. There was two other German writers, one called Hermann Brock, who also talked about the idea of the caesura, but said it's more about the composer feeling that they don't belong in the time, which I'll come back to in a bit. And then another man called Gottfried Benn, who talks more about how old age affects late style, because as people have said, we have composers like, say, for example, Mozart was the one who really got brought up very quickly in this discussion. And people said, well, he was only in his 30s when he died. But is there a late style there? Because he's not old, so he's not really aware of death and thinking about that until very close to his death, because it was sudden. I think that sort of was the groundwork, and it's been progressed mainly by a man called Edward Said, who was sort of the Adorno disciple, as it were, and he writes there's a really excellent article about Richard Strauss, and he talks about his operas. And so after Salome and Electra, these two gargantuan operas, that suddenly he changes direction, and we have this sort of, he revisits the sort of 19th century with Rosenkavalier, and it's a complete change, and he says this is the kind of thing that we should be looking at. It's composers who go, either I don't belong, or you have a need to sort of try and reconnect with the past. And I think that's something that really rings true with Howells, and it's something that everyone has talked about with Howells, his love of early music. He's not just connecting with his own past, but the past of this country and its musical heritage. So
the late style is very much a kind of, for you, and a lot of these writers, is about the human condition, isn't it? It's kind of, late style equals kind of works that tell us something about what it is to be human, and taps into kind of, I think of Wagner writing about Beethoven, and the fact that you listen to a Beethoven string quartet and the late quartets because they transcend the drudgery of human existence, and they rise us above the fact that we are, I'm thinking of Jonathan Miller, basically in this life, our profession in life is to die, and very much the kind of Schopenhauer Nietzsche, life is miserable, but by listening to these wonderful late works by Beethoven, they raise us above the drudgery of human existence.
Exactly.
And I can understand why people would listen to things like the Stabat Mater and particularly the Stabat Mater, because it deals with that trauma, doesn't it, and the pain, not just of human existence, but of a very particular story. And so it has that combination of agony, but also raising us up and portraying existence as worthwhile in a particular way. And I think that works. I suppose our problem as Howells scholars is where do you put it? Yeah, this is the problem with Mozart. Late style is pretty meaningless if he's dead in his mid-30s. So for Howells, where do we carve this up? You were talking about the Spicer delineation, and I pulled out a quote from from your thesis. This is Paul Spicer writing on page 77, if you want to look at it. What followed over another 13 years or so of composing life consisted of a plethora of increasingly irrelevant choral pieces composed mainly to satisfy the apparent insatiable appetite of organists, that's a loaded term, isn't it, who wanted the kudos of their own Howells dedication. Certainly there is significant music after Stabat Mater, but the long coda which brought his life to its conclusion was soft-pedalled after his great work was really done. The fact that he says great work is also, it's another loaded term. It's the kind of genius, the great composer Beethoven is looming large here, isn't he? And I think, so our problem is actually, how do you carve up Howells' life to make meaningful observations about his development and how you understand his music and what pieces relate to each other, and was he just on a kind of canticle pilgrimage, and which works do you put together to make sense of all this output? And I think what we frequently mean by late style, if we use that term, is everything that comes after the Second World War, isn't it? Yeah. Which for Howells happens to be, like Mozart, well before his... it's problematic in terms of it's not that late in his life. Yeah. If we're talking about late works from the 1940s and 40-year period after that. But it does make sense in some ways, doesn't it? I mean, there's. I'm thinking about the number of letters I've read where Howells increasingly goes, I really don't care what people think. And this manifests itself in various ways in terms of, think of the Redcliffe Te Deum, where he was commissioned to do, and basically what was an easy choir Te Deum. They wanted something that could be rehearsed in a few days maximum. They got something that was incredibly difficult, and were exceptionally angry about it. But they did perform it, and then it disappeared from the repertoire, and Andrew Cooke has resurrected it recently. But I think that shows that Howells had reached a stage then where he was able to say the sort of gremlins that stalked him, certainly in relation to the Second Piano Concerto in 1925, and he had this kind of breakdown about critics. He was able in later life to say, actually, I don't care what people think. I'm going to write this, and out it goes into the world, and it's about that freedom, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's that hilarious the Cole mag for Magdalen, Oxford, and he says in a letter to Bernard Rose, I do hope it's not too tricky. I can change it if need be. And you sort of, but it feels slightly sort of backhanded, because of course Bernard Rose is going to write back and say, yeah, it is actually a bit too tricky, can you please change it? I think he knows that he's, as you say, he's more than happy just to sort of write what he wants. But as we've discussed, especially with the mags and nugs, it's a medium that he's been writing in all his life. And really, especially these services, for example, Winchester, Salisbury and Chichester are all written in the same year. And you sort of think, how can one person, even as good as Howells, really sort of redefine what this text is and do something different with it every time? And I think he's certainly doing new things there. He's trying new things. There's that Spicer and Philip Cooke talk about the Chichester service and how it has this fiendishly difficult opening for the trebles, where they're a tone apart for lots of this. And so that's why it's not done, because it's just too difficult to do. But yeah, I think there's definitely sort of this idea. And I think what's also quite interesting is that going back to the Stabat Mater, and your talk that you did a few years ago about sort of mourning and Howells and that kind of thing here, you talked about how he's never confronting death himself. He's always approaching it as a mourner. I think that's something very interesting. he never really thinks that, he's never sort of saying, I'm thinking about my own death. And there's a sort of shift slightly in texts in the 70s where he starts to kind of allude to this, that he may be, I'm thinking of Come My Soul, for example, with that famous lead me to my journey's end at the end of the poem. And obviously, some texts were given to him, he didn't sort of have a choice, and it's important that we don't try and twist that as, oh, well, look, this is the text that he said. Well, actually, no, if some dean says, please set this text, he's not got much of a say in it. But I think it is interesting that sort of in the last sort of 7-8 years of composing, he does kind of start to think about, I mean, by this point he's in his 80s. He's well aware that he's not got long left. And there's a really interesting shift there, especially when we think sort of from Stabat Mater, where he's very much the mourner, I think. He's sort of, that's what he's doing for us as the human condition. How do we deal with this thing that we all have to process at different points in our lives?
Yeah, I suppose the thing to point out with Howells as well in terms of mortality, he'd been there much earlier, right? As a student, he was given 6 months to live, and he was recuperating in Edney, and there was a particularly painful moment where he overheard his family discussing this, and he found it very, very traumatic. As you might imagine, I mean, you know, the treatment he was receiving, he had radium, but they didn't really know anything about the dosage. So they injected him, and they kept injecting him until he passed out, because they thought, let's get as much into his system as we could possibly manage. Of course, it saved him, so it was good. But one of the great things that they have in the RCM are the prescriptions from this period. And he had a prescription if he was feeling unwell, particularly unwell after this, recuperating in Edney. I can't imagine how bad he felt at this point. He had a prescription for arsenic, and I sent it to the Royal Pharmaceutical Society to comment on, and they said, yeah, a lot of arsenic. And the great thing about these private prescriptions in those days is you just kept taking them back to the chemist, and they kept giving you redispensing it. So he could take quite large quantities of arsenic during this period. So he's had this period of really dealing with his own mortality. So I wonder whether after that, it's really, and we've talked a bit about in the past about the elegy and the way that plays out as lived experience of mortality. It's interesting when you were talking about all these Magnificat settings. I was thinking, possibly because we've got so many pretty pictures in here of the Abbey, and they all look pretty much the same to me. I was thinking about all of those Monet pictures of haystacks, or the kind of Picasso ones. Going to the Picasso Museum in Barcelona once and seeing 20 pictures of prostitute with dog. And they all seem to have the same thing. And those kind of studies where people return to the same thing again and again and again. And I wonder whether the 3 Magnuncs in 1 year was a similar thing. It's the kind of it's a kind of artistic response to see, well, I'll keep doing these until I get one right, and I'm happy with it. And I mean, those were clearly, the Southern Cathedral Festival was the focus, and John Birch was at the college and was able to convince Howells to produce these and keep producing these. And was a particularly close friend, so he was hardly going to say no. But I just wonder whether Howells ever expected any of those settings to be heard again, because I think he wanted the cathedrals themselves to take them on, but he saw them as personal possessions, didn't he? So that Chichester would do their setting, but nobody else would do the Chichester service. Why would they? Because it's the Chichester service. And he was almost surprised that they were published. And Novello kept actually taking all of these settings, and because he was very surprised, I think. So I think when we hear Westminster today, we should listen to it as this was the setting that he gave for this place, and there's something very special about coming here and hearing that particular service, and particularly since I listened to it in a recording with Martin conducting it, and to be around people for whom this is their lived experience as well. So there's something quite remarkable about that.
Yeah, there certainly is. I think it's Yeah, these three solos I've really sort of struggled with, because I think also by this point, I think he's almost slightly in his own sort of in a shadow of his former self, in that, he's knocked out these services in the 40s that everyone, by this point, people are starting to do them, and not just the places where they've been written for. And I think even now, I remember playing the York service to someone. I mean, personally, I quite like the York service. If you don't, that's absolutely fine. But their response was, "Yeah, but it's not got the Gloucester Gloria, though, has it?" And I think that's the problem, that he gave everything to these settings in the 40s, and they are very fine settings. But I think there's almost that problem of, well, where does he go from there? And is there actually more that he has to say with this text or not? And there are some really interesting things. You go through the manuscripts of these pieces, and there's some really interesting and quite more sort of modernist than we sort of attach to him ideas that he's playing with. Especially, again, I'm going back to the Magdalen because that was one that I focused on. But he has this really interesting sort of 6/8/5/8 pattern going on, and you think he then ditches it and goes to a 9/8, just much more easier to sing. But you think, gosh, if it had been this sort of 6/8/5/8 thing, there's no way it would have been done more than once. And luckily, they did. Magdalen did sort of really go with this piece when Bernard Rose was there. They did it a few times actually, which I think even that Howells was shocked at. He had to turn down sort of going to listen to it. I think the first 2 times he performed it, I think he felt slightly bad, but probably didn't really think much of that piece at the time. But I just to jump back slightly, you were talking about Howells and his radium treatment, and actually when you approach late style in Howells, that's a really problematic thing, and it's something that Philip Cooke tries to sort of tackle in his article. And he uses a sort of theory around late style called disability style, and the idea that either a mental or physical disability is what kickstarts the late style. But as I've written about, as Harold has also written about, that really doesn't add up with Howells, because then technically his late style starts in his 20s. But as we know, there's so much development that goes on after that. So does that approach really work? And it's something we have to be so careful of when we approach late style and Howells, because he has got this really unique sort of relationship with death and mourning that not many composers really have. Slightly, yes, with sort of the First World War, and so mourning is a big thing, but his own personal sort of, you've got 6 months to live, and he had barely written anything by this point. You sort of think, what must that have done to him? But then to lead this exceptionally long life, where really, Alan Ridout talks about in his book sort of how death was always with Howells, and it was he would talk about Michael a lot, but just death more generally and mourning. And there's that story that he tells about playing, Howells played a piece of music which he thought was the best piece of music to sort of represent mourning, and it was his elegy, which Alan only knew because he'd heard a recording a few days earlier, but most students at the RCM didn't know. So I think Howells is a really tricky one. The more you go into it, the more it becomes a really thorny issue. And how do you sort of approach these final works?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking very much as musicologists, but there's also a problem with as a performer, isn't there? Because I mean, to me, I'll give you an example. I mean, the recording that came out of the Missa Sabrinensis, the first commercial disc on Chandos, sounds like a late work. It's like the Missa Sabrinensis has been clearly allied mentally with Beethoven again, probably, Missa Solemnis. It's that kind of, this is a great work, it is a big work, it is performed in a big way, but it also, I think the conductor goes at it in a way that suggests that reverence. So all of the tempos are grand and are all quite slow because they're giving that whole aesthetic of the grand post-Beethoven mass, and that's why that recording doesn't really work for me, in that because it hasn't got the rhythmic energy and precision and momentum that actually Howells wanted. And of course David Hill's recording with the Bach Choir, I think it's a lot more successful because it's much shorter, but it doesn't treat the Missa Sabrinensis like a late work. So I think there's late works from a musicology point of view, but there's also a late work from a performer's point of view, like works that you have to treat with reverence, and you hold your score in a particular way, and and it's hard to get away from that sometimes, isn't it? And I think the success sometimes, I think the success for Wilcox doing it was because he didn't have that reverence for Howells. Howells was a colleague for him, and he was Howells's boss, and the hierarchy was completely different, wasn't it? And I think that's why he was so successful at creating almost kind of no-nonsense performances that didn't have that sort of reverence, and took the music on its own terms, rather than Howells drowning in the weight of baggage of what a great work must be. Because I think, Paul and Philip both see these works as the pinnacle of a career, as you've highlighted. And I think this is very problematic, because some of the greatest British chamber music of the 20th century is written by Howells during the First World War. Okay, so some of the greatest songs are written straight after the First World War by Howells. And you see, what are the landmarks of Howells's life and music that allow us to get our bearings? We're drawn to these great big works, aren't we, of late style. They must be this kind of culmination of a life's work. And he refused to play that game, I think. He was constantly experimenting and taking risks, and I think you're right in saying that some of these risks didn't pay off. But it's I think when you were talking about the Magnum Nuncs in a certain year, I was thinking about Stanford with being told by his publisher that they could really do with organ sonatas in 1917, so he wrote 5 of them in a year. And some of the movements are really good, but some of them aren't, and it's because his publisher asked him for 5 organ sonatas in the same year. And I think it's almost unfair to assess Howells from just the recordings, or just we need the context of why these pieces were written, and were they ever written to be heard again? The thing I worried about with the piano music was what was going to happen when it got kind of international scrutiny. So we've got over 500,000 people listening to Volume 1 of Matthew Shellhorn's disc, and thankfully they keep listening again and again, because actually a lot of that music comes from a golden period, and he had a lot of things to say. But I think what it proves is that Howells was very good at writing miniatures, which is something that we know. But the problem with late style is that late style is about big works, isn't it? It's about quite a lot of the time. Paul dismisses those other choral works because they're not the big statement pieces, are they? Whereas Howells's miniatures, in a way, are where he was extremely successful at a certain point.
I think there's a lot there. Well, I remember sort of this summer with the proms and the Mahler 2, and I remember thinking, imagine if that was Mr. Sabrinensis. And I think that's kind of the problem, is that we have this huge work that you kind of feel that you have to say, this must be the pinnacle because it's so big. And actually what I think is really interesting, and we've talked about this before, is the English Mass that follows it. How he kind of has the sort of the language of this, but it's reduced so much. I think that's what I find particularly so interesting, is how the grandiose of all these works is gone in the last works. It's on a much more smaller scale, but actually it creates a much greater intensity, I think, in what he's doing. And it's also, I think, really important that we don't forget things like the works for organ or the sonatina, that kind of thing, because these are really interesting sort of. Basically, everything is choral and is sacred, apart from the couple of secular motets and 75 sweetest of sweets and antiphon. So it's really interesting to look at these pieces that are kind of the outliers of the late period, if you want to call it that. I find that slightly prickly as a term because it immediately implies something. It's loaded, really. And it sounded something that I couldn't really cover. But sort of how do these works fit into this? And Philip does talk about this. He talks about sort of the organ works of the late period, and how they are a connection to Howells's love of early music, which I'm not sure I entirely subscribe to. But yeah, I think it's really interesting that there are these sort of there's just a few pieces dotted around that are really sort of, is this actually more the Howells that is writing pieces that he wants to write, rather than a sort of, not to downplay them, but to sort of write another Magen for somewhere else, or another Te Deum session or something. And they are great works, but he's so comfortable in this medium compared to, say, especially I think the sonatina is really interesting because he hasn't written a piano work for at least 40, 50 years or something. Correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the piano
works. Written a lot of small piano.
Yeah.
I think, not a major one. Yes and no. I suppose the thing that I'm interested in is that this is all about a linear trajectory, isn't it, of Howells's life. But actually, one of the things that characterises his creative process is revisiting things, right? So much of his mind is cyclic. It's about going back to things very regularly. It's about using part of a piano piece from 1921 in the sonatina of 1971. So it's about, never being quite satisfied with things and going back to things and revising things. And the same way that the cello concerto for me is that work, because it's the one that I looked at most, and this desire to come to a piece every single year and keep looking at it. And still in the early 80s, he's still thinking about it and still sketching away and writing. And I suppose in the case of the mags, people took them off him and they published them. Yeah. But John Birch got the partita from Howells, and he got it in I think it was a very poor photocopy. And so he was on an associated board examining tour to South Africa, and he wrote it out. And so he learnt it by writing it out. It's a very kind of Barkian idea, isn't it? And Howells came back in January and said, "You're about to play this. I'd like to make these changes." And John Birch went, "No, go jump. I've learnt it now. I am not going to change this." Meanwhile, Hilary McNamara, who was having the same problem with the sonatina, was carefully learning the new bits and taking out old bits, and was very understanding of that. And whereas John Birch was holding off, and so I think in the partita we get exactly what John Birch played and what was published, and we have a kind of unity of thought. But I think Howells would have been coming back to that even now if he could do. So I think that revisiting is a very interesting thing. Because the problem with late style, as you said, we need this kind of severing, this very modernist idea that we're severing from the earlier stuff in life, and then we're going to write the kind of stuff that really deals with the nitty-gritty of existence. Whereas that doesn't happen with Howells. Howells' compositional development is a continuous process of empirical development. Right? He's got his experiments. He talks about experiments to Marion Scott, and he just keeps experimenting. And every so often people take things off him and publish them. And he must have been a nightmare to deal with from the publishing point of view, because he was constantly wanting to try things and change things, and sometimes they got a version of something. I think Paul Spicer actually gave the premiere of the partita, the organ partita, by accident, because Novello were producing the score, and he went down to Novello some months before they were producing it, and was given a copy. So he played it before John Birch. But thankfully it didn't change. But that happened with other pieces. So I think, although there are lots of ideas within late style that are interested to think about, it's massively problematic with Howells. And so I think our next question is therefore, how do you divide up this life? And what are the major points? Because that, I mean, for me, that's what are my chapters going to be in a book? Or for you, it might be, how am I going to listen to these CDs and understand these works in relation to each other? Or for your problem is that what chapters do I have in my PhD thesis? Because we want to have this kind of idea of periods. I've, in my own PhD, had 3 periods. I had an early period which was about Howells studying with Stanford. I would revise that now because I think there was a very different Howells that was studying with Brewer. So I think Herbert Brewer produced in Howells a ready-to-go composer who had to change direction a lot when he went to the college because Stanford didn't like a lot of the things he was doing. Not a lot, because Brewer had been a Stanford pupil, so I think there was already quite a lot of the groundwork set, but there's a lot of very Wagnerian process and some really amazing harmony in the violin sonata, the B minor violin sonata, and in the early songs, and listening to the Summer Idylls on the piano disc. This is a very good composer who would change direction immediately once he went to South Kensington. So dare I say, because the Stanford Society might get a hold of this, that Stanford might have not been a good influence on Howells, perhaps. We might think about Stanford being actually a very conservative influence on him at a time when he was having all sorts of modern and exciting ideas. I think one of the problems with 1925 was not just that the piano concerto was received quite in a hostile way because of this incident where the critics stood up and shouted, "Thank God that's over," but also that Howells didn't have the reassurance of Stanford there. So Stanford had just died at that point and had really been holding Howells up before that. So he had problems. He had things that went down badly before that, but Stanford was very good at telling him to ignore it and plod on, whereas after Stanford's death, second piano concerto failure was to him a really big deal. I think Howells would be a much bigger name now if in 1925 he'd ridden that wave of after that instant, the premiere, because it's just like the Rite of Spring riot, isn't it? Where Stravinsky's career was made because people didn't like that ballet, and I think Howells's reputation could have been that. It's certainly the way that Arthur Bliss was continuing at that point, because he was kind of enfant terrible in that sense. And I think it was interesting the way he plays that in his career going forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it's a thing that I struggle with the most, actually, was trying to put Howells into periods. And as I was saying to you yesterday, the absolute relief of when I read through Jonathan's PhD recently and saw that we kind of matched up, and I thought, this is quite reassuring.
We basically, because we've got to draw this to a close, but I would say that we both decided that Howells's late period starts in 1941, basically, and are happy to divide that up, which is quite problematic for a book. And it is a problem, but I think it's definitely true to say that we have early music, then we have a period of experimenting to form a new style. So Lambert's clavichord, the organ sonata, the second organ sonata, I think is very important. Works like that, and the Concerto for String Orchestra, all sorts of getting Tudor music in there. Also the scale, sharpened fourths, flattened sevenths that everybody talks about, which comes from Vaughan Williams' Fourth Symphony. It was Howells's own analysis of that highlighted that particular scale, and then he uses that in everything in the late style. So I think there's this period of experimenting, which I call the middle period in the 30s, and then everything after 41, I think, is kind of taking off in that new direction, and that for me is that late style. Anyway, it's one way of thinking about it. Thank you very much, Tom.
Well,
good luck with everything, and I'm sure we'll hear from you again in the near future.
Yeah, sure, definitely. Thank you.